E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā karangatanga maha huri i te motu, huri i te ao. Nau mai rarau, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora, my name is Oriini Kaipara and I will be your host in this very special VIP dialogue where we'll look into the future, how to build a future. In fact, we're going to look into how business can help to build a collective and resilient future through trade. To discuss this important topic, I'm joined by two esteemed guests. The first, of course, is John Denton, who is the Secretary-General of the International Chamber of Commerce. John is a global leader. He's a global business leader and international advisor on policy, and he's also a legal expert on investment and trade internationally. Our second guest is Fraser Whineray, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Fonterra, which is one of the world's leading dairy exporters. Now, of course, Fraser comes from Aotea, New Zealand, e mihi ana ki a koe o tira kōrua. He has enjoyed a diverse international career across agriculture, investment banking, and he is also a former chief executive of Mercury New Zealand Limited, which is a renewable electricity company here in New Zealand. Our panellists bring a considerable international experience, amount of knowledge, a wealth of knowledge, and so I encourage all our participants who join us today and in the next 30 days to put your burning questions forward and deliver those here. This is your opportunity, so seize the opportunity. You can submit those questions via the MS chat function, and to do that, of course, it's as simple as clicking in and asking your partai. I'll put those to our two panellists right here, right now. But to kick off this session, I will throw the first question. Economic recovery is a key theme of this year's APEC CEO Summit. And of course, trade is it plays a huge part of that. At the summit, we've been discussing how APEC economies work together to support the economic recovery. So John, kia ora to you. I want to put this question to you first before we pass it over to Fraser. What are the key challenges you're seeing at the individual business level?
Thanks very much, and kia ora to you and to all my friends in New Zealand and in my old buddies in the APEC business community. I was proudly part of the APEC Business Advisory Council for many years, chairing finance and economics, and before that, sustainable development. It was a very interesting period of my life. Three areas. Well, first, uncertainty. The second, it's pretty clear that we're seeing a lot of what I say is inward looking by governments. And the third is there's a really, I'd say, acute heightened risk to the existence of small businesses when you think about the importance of the small business and the SME part of the economy, particularly in Asia Pac, where it's 98%. Accounting for more than 50% of employment. This is an incredibly important issue. On the uncertainty side, I mean, you're seeing that a bit in New Zealand, I think, as you sit there today, unable to meet with each other. I mean, the uncertainty around borders being open, closed, what is required. Can people come up with a narrative to get themselves out of the Delta rave? Can they actually get to reopening? This huge amount of uncertainty. Uncertainty has always been a constant for business, but I think in the way in which global cooperation has broken down, the level of uncertainty has just been heightened. So this is a really big issue. This issue I talked about, inward looking by governments, trying to grapple with an issue like a pandemic, to grapple with an issue like climate change. These problems don't have passports. You actually need to be able to cooperate and talk at a global level. It just hasn't happened. What we saw very quickly, particularly around COVID, and just roll your mind back about 18 months when you had the PPE crisis in Europe, where you actually had the French government intervening directly into manufacture to thwart contracts and have goods, PPE actually redistributed within the French economy, which is already promised somewhere else. And you saw the whole ventilator crisis, which occurred as well. You would have thought we'd learned from that, but we didn't. We repeated it. And then you even had crazy things like the European export controls that were actually designed to limit access and limit distribution of the vaccine itself, even though we all know that equitable distribution of vaccines across the global world is the only thing that will bring the pandemic to an end and get global economic growth going again. And as for SMEs, I mean, we launched a campaign in March of the first year of the COVID crisis because we saw the immediate hit on SMEs with the collapse of value chains even before the actual pandemic hit economies. Like in Bangladesh, the value chain collapsed around garments before COVID actually hit Bangladesh, because there'd been a lockdown and closed down in the US, which means consumers had shut up and unable to go to shops, etc., which meant there was just all this collapse through that whole value chain, and 1 million people went out of work, and think of all the subbies that went down. And I've just come out of a big project in travel and tourism where we see more than 90 million people lose their jobs, most of whom are women and young people. And think of all the SMEs that have been hurt there. So there's a heightened risk of danger to SMEs. So uncertainty, inward looking, and a heightened risk of danger for SMEs. These are three problems we see. If you like, I can talk about solutions, but at the moment, I just thought I'd roll out the problems.
I love the fact that you bring solutions as well as the problems and raise those here right here with us now. Fraser, is there anything much different to what John's already described in terms of the challenges we're facing here locally in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Yeah, well, kia ora, Oriini, and also tēnā koe, John. It's great to be on the panel with you both and acknowledge the hui of the APEC CEO Summit and all those who have put it together. Look, just narrowing down on a couple of different angles, and John being international diplomat and from a very fantastic view at the International Chamber of Commerce of the whole world. I mean, I think there's three things also I'd like to emphasise. One is around well-being of people. John's touched on that with respect to what happens to the SMEs and how that can disproportionately affect particular demographics in society. In our sense, well-being for our people even, and it might sound trivial, but the mental health and strain of not being able to see loved ones, not being able to travel. I've got people in offices overseas who haven't been into the office for 600 days and have been working in small apartments with families around them and homeschooling, and of course all of the things that are necessary to ensure safe production of food back in our facilities here. All of the things that we take for normal, whether being able to even meet and talk in a cafeteria to share thoughts. You can't do that. You have to have a lot of PPE on, and there has to be a lot of distancing, even though we haven't had a large Delta outbreak yet in New Zealand. So that's one thing, is just generally the well-being, exacerbated by the uncertainty of when the future will change or return to normal. And I think the return to normal isn't really going to be one. And so I'm sure there'll be more conversations about that over the next 48 hours. Specifically, the second thing is on supply chain. Supply chains like to work like a metronome, and it's kind of been like watching all of the different timings of instruments feels like watching a kindergarten with kids bashing drums. I mean, there's been bullwhips and things out of time, and that precipitates a lot of challenges, including supply side inflation pressure. And for us, we had a record export year of 2.6 million tonnes of low carbon dairy produce to 130 economies. Eight of the top 10 economies we export to are in APEC, so that's very important. And that's so that they could enjoy the safe nutrition. But that has been very, very complicated. And the amount of effort that goes in, and blanking of ships and timing of vessels and all of the logistics that go to that, and collecting cash and treasury functions has been extremely complicated because a lot of additional rules that have had to come in. Lastly, consumer behaviours have been very different. I tend to look at this one as more of opportunity than necessarily a challenge for business. When we saw different countries bring in different rules, you had you're not allowed to go to restaurants, so the out-of-home food service experience stopped. But then the rise of online plus home delivery just was another food service channel which has just expanded way beyond anyone's earlier projections pre-COVID. And that actually requires some quite different ways of servicing that channel and products to support that. Also, you've seen consumers go for more nutrition-dense foods and health and immunity as they're looking for assurance in the face of a pandemic. How do they maximise their chances of staying well? So those are kind of three things, just at a slightly more smaller level: the well-being, the supply chains, and the consumer behaviours have been very dynamic and bouncing around depending on what's happening in economies.
Yeah, important.
Well, just picking up, guys pick up on
course.
that, because in a way, going to solutions. I mean, What I would say, in the 3 problems identified, I mean, a key element here, particularly for SMEs, but for business in general, is building in resilience. I think part of that is actually around the digital side. It's very hard to imagine a business being able to function effectively in the COVID period, but also subsequent to that now as we move forward without having a digital platform. But as you were saying, and this is something that we worked on very hard, it's one thing to actually have access to digital tools. The other is to actually create a digital business model, an operating model. A business model can actually work. I mean, you can move from being a restaurant which serves in-house to being a restaurant that offers out-house, but you've got to think about your actual menu. You've got to think about your customer. You've got to actually understand who your community is. You've got to actually, therefore, there's a whole lot of different elements that need to go into that. So resilience is really important. I mean, a level of mental well-being is quite helpful, and of course, optimism is always good in business. But that's something which flows through things, because there's, as I was saying, uncertainty is a problem. Inward-looking government's a problem. A heightened risk for SMEs. But uncertainty is always a problem. This is just heightened. So you actually have to build this level of resilience and agility. And I genuinely think part of the challenge for government here is to actually think about the end users if they want economy to grow, which is businesses and consumers, uncomplicating their lives, making it easier, for example, to have digital recognition of negotiable instruments. You know that even in the midst of COVID, when you've had this extraordinary uptake in the use of the digital platform, only something like, I'll give you a bad number, but it's true, it's 0.1% of bills of lading are actually digital.
Really?
Now, that's the life of global trade. And that's because governments still require paper-based presentation. You know, in Japan at the moment, and I hope there are a number of people on the call from Japan, one of the reasons that the economy has become sclerotic is you still have to present paper documents for wet stamps. And this has been a huge problem we've seen in the global community, particularly in Africa, where we couldn't get goods across borders, even goods to support treatment of COVID, because there was an inability to actually have the documents stamped. So we had to move quickly to work to digitize customs facilities and change laws to allow phytosanitary to move through. It's actually extraordinary. So resilience, we can yell at people and tell them they have to get digital, but there's a lot of stuff that has to go with that as well. Yeah. And also governments have to move and regulatory authorities have to move to enable that. You can take a lot of the pain out of uncertainty by making it easier to work with the digital world. You can actually force the world to look more outward than inward if they realize that to actually get stuff across borders, you've got to have digital recognition. And there's other things we can talk about. Yeah. And this heightened risk to SMEs, maybe you can help them by doing this as well. They're my solutions. How's that?
They're great solutions. Fraser, I want to bring you into this. How would you suggest that we build resilience, businesses build resilience, and what can they do practically? I'll give you a chance to jump in there.
I think the resilience, just pick up on that too, and flowing from what John was talking about, the shipping documentation, for one, is hundreds of years old in terms of its practice. We managed to do one of the first fully blockchain deals of the 7 entities, I think, typically that are required just for one shipment to go in terms of bills of lading, insurance, finance, etc., and the government documentation. So that has a long way to go and will certainly free up if that ecosystem was presented, then a lot more trade and commerce can happen with far less friction. But I think one of the big cathartic moments happens when you go, after a while, we're not going to return to where we were in December 2019. And you can go forward to a better place, but also, when you assume it won't go back to normal, then you sort of really plan for the future. Like we kept on having ships blank, and DIFOT was going down for our customers, and it's getting tricky. And then we said, the shipping's not going to return to normal, so let's go and contract for a whole bunch more vessels and then take a whole bunch of pain out of the system. Now, that's not cheap to do. Fortunately, we're in a position with our partnerships with Maersk, et cetera, to do that. But it's sort of not hoping for things to return, I think, is an important first step. The second thing, and it's one of the great benefits potentially to have come out of COVID, is the need to simplify and focus only on what's important. I mean, we just simply don't have time, given the new ways of working. We don't have time to work on things that are nice to have. You have to work on things that are really important for today's business to deliver for your customers or in your owners and all of the other important stakeholders to an organisation. And you can only do the things that are really going to make the most difference. And I think that has been a slight benefit because some of the noise in activity has been taken away. I think it's very important to dynamically cover risk. It is moving so quickly. There are so many different economies which have lots of different arrangements and lots of different experiences with COVID. It is a daily, if not hourly, channel of things that have to be adapted to, and taking care of people. Right now, the well-being of people hasn't been more important. The access to capability, the access to talent is getting scarcer. Most economies are experiencing this, and people movement around the world is constrained. So really partnering rather than necessarily buying or building your own is essential to accelerate an economic recovery. But it is quite a different recovery to, I guess, going back to where things were in December 2019.
I find it absolutely fascinating that, you know, trade is still paper bound. You know, John, in order to move forward, one of the key themes that's coming up here at the CEO Summit, the APEC CEO Summit, is of course digital and moving forward with digital solutions. And you mentioned quite a bit about digital. How do you digitize that? Should that be led by businesses or, you know, working together closely with government? You talked about inward governments. Are we seeing there's a reluctance to move to a digital-based solution? What's going on there? Where's the breakdown? Why are we still working with paper?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of people who actually make a bit of money out of the inefficiencies of the current system. Never underestimate the power of the rent seekers to actually stop progress. There are a lot of inefficiencies that actually have made people a lot of money over many, many years, and they're reluctant to give up those inefficiencies. But they, of course, are not the only problem. Part of the problem is actually not understanding what is actually necessary. It's one thing for governments to exhort people to go digital, but failing to understand that you actually have to create standards to enable that to happen. You actually have to create legally enforceable documents or legally enforceable regimes for that to happen. You've got to have adoption. What we do at the ICC, and ICC is a very interesting beast, and I took over here 3 years ago, having come out of the private sector, to actually lead what's called the world's largest private sector organisation. We comprise 50 million businesses in 135 countries. In fact, 2/3 of the ICC is in developing and emerging economies. So this is quite an interesting issue for me. What we've always been famous on, we actually have our own courts. We actually have a seat at the United Nations. We're the principal interlocutor at the WTO, at the G20, etc., for the private sector these days. But what we always say is that we lead where governments can't. So we just get up and we create standards because we are an institution, a not-for-profit, with over 100 years worth of credibility. And so we're creating a digital standards initiative at a hub I grew out of our Singapore premises. We actually use it as our innovation hub. And a big shout out to everyone in Singapore. I'll be there next week for Bloomberg. But the reason we did Singapore, because it has one of the most generous regimes to enable digitization. And what we realized is there were no standards that enabled us to actually get to one platform for bills of lading. There are a bunch of fragmented plays that are happening in the global economy because people saw opportunity there, but there was no operating platform which enabled interoperability. And so we, as it's basically a public commons, a private sector commons, we're able to provide that. So we are providing that commons which will enable the standards which will actually help digitization. And frankly, the issue of legal frameworks is a nonsense. We've just been working closely with the G7. We've got endorsement to take, there's already model laws that have been developed by UNCITRAL, which is a UN body, about how you actually give legal recognition to digital negotiable instruments. So that's all there. What's happening is that policymakers are very slow. What's happened is that there's interference along the way. What's happened is, will I actually expend political capital to get this through? I think we all know, even in the APEC region, that services reform is actually the hardest reform. And as Alan Bollard said in the keynote panel I was on just before, merchandise trade has recovered very well in APEC, but services trade is going nowhere. Why is that? Because services reform is hard. There are a lot of vested interests involved there, and politicians really, and policymakers really need to understand that the bigger benefit to the world is actually having a functioning digital platform. And that's why we at the ICC, we will create that, and we will actually create the capacity for complementarity in the event that the digital platform splits, So some people would know that there's a risk that might happen as well between two competing systems. And we want to make certain that we can still manage that, because it's so important to the real economy to get that, to maintain that and develop those standards. And of course, standards is actually what underpinned the success of APEC in the first place. Because without standards, you would never have the supply chain revolution that drove the economic growth in APEC. And thank God for that, because without that growth in APEC, the global economy would be in a seriously poor place.
Absolutely. Hey, Fraser, I just want to bring you in. Anything to add to that? John's raised some very key points, good key points and insights there.
Yeah, standards are very important there, Oriini, but also with the digital side comes a security of those. I mean, when people are walking around with a document which says they own what's on that ship, or they're insured it, or they've got the trade financing for it, and that's given a stamp and a chop and probably a wax seal and something else, that's in their hand, and that actually matters. That is, that's the right to it. So when you put this on a digital platform, some standards needs to be worked through, and security of those documents, so that they, because we all know cybersecurity is obviously a critical part of enabling the digital. Well, cybersecurity is critical for the digital economy to thrive. Otherwise, people will lose trust in the platforms. But standards, the likes of which the ICC there is standing up and pushing for, are really important. Where between economies to solve that just directly gets very, that'll take forever. And ICC has a great mandate to do those things. I think other things to build back on a sustainable economic recovery, though. As we're talking about, to accelerate out of here, not necessarily go back to where we were, the trade is essential. It has to keep driving. I know the goods trade, as you mentioned, the Ellen Bollard touched on, but we do need things. Even for COP26 is on at the moment. We're trying to find low carbon solutions. Some countries are better at doing low carbon activities of different types than others. We're looking to import some components for biomass boilers to replace some coal on the remaining sites that use it. They now have much longer lead times because them and the upstream access to the commodities that are necessary to manufacture that technical equipment out of Europe are constrained, and it takes a lot longer, obviously, to get things down on the ship. So it is really important we get the trade, not just for the economy and then for helping people have that rising economic tide and social outcomes, but also for the sustainability aspects of an economic recovery as well, which can't be dealt with evenly in each country. That's the purpose of trade. Some people are good at some things, some are good at others. And by working together, you end up lifting the whole lot.
What about open markets, Fraser, in terms of Fonterra? How important have open markets and trade been for Fonterra specifically when navigating the complexities of the pandemic and in looking toward driving more sustainable economic recovery?
Yeah, well, the bit I was touching on there about how sustainability and low carbon activity will vary depending on countries' unique capabilities. But trade has been essential for us. I mean, well, for Fonterra specifically, 95% of our produce is exported, and without some predictability around that, then that's very difficult to manage. Sure, there's been some challenges in supply chain and changes in consumer channels, like I mentioned earlier, but generally, what we need to thrive is that certainty and predictability of those arrangements. It's also very important that everyone dynamically manages the COVID impacts. They're all felt differently in each country, depending on a whole range of factors, and we can't all see what is driving particular decisions and economies, and that's because they're all different. But rules have been very quick to come in, and I think it's very important that we're equally quick to remove those barriers, which were put in place for very legitimate reasons, when they no longer need to exist, so that we can get back on with the Putrajaya vision and what APEC was actually set up to do, which is lift the well-being of all of its member economies.
John, you mentioned earlier that some things are moving very slowly, so I want to change tact here a little and pick up on something our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern mentioned earlier on the main broadcast. Trade is fundamental to APEC and the economic recovery of our regional economies. How do we deal with growing calls in some circles for nationalism?
Great question, actually, and if Jacinda said that, she's right on the money. I'm going to frame it a little bit differently. I used to be on the board of the Business Council of Australia for a number of years. And one of the points I continually made there was that you should never take public support for open markets for granted. In a way, it's privileged, it's granted to you by citizens to actually operate an economy which does have an open market, but in return, they do expect things. They expect a kind of citizen's bargain, part of which will be investment in their futures, education, the fact that they will benefit from an open market as well. And I think it's fair to say that there's probably been a couple of phases here historically, and I'll be very quick so it won't be a lecture, but in the immediate post-war period, there was, in terms of the reconstruction of the global world after the Second World War, there was a recognition that governments would do certain things, and in return, the citizens would get access to education, access to health systems. It's called the citizen's bargain. Then when we pushed on and said we wanted to open markets more, this is pushing it a little bit further, it's called the Washington Consensus or the Great Global Liberalization. The citizens were said, we've done so well, so citizens, you should just trust us now because the benefits will trickle down to you. Well, frankly, most citizens would say they haven't felt this as a pouring rain. They felt from time to time drops. So when people talk about circles of rising nationalism, it's true because a lot of citizens don't feel that they've actually benefited from open markets. Now, we can provide the data which shows on aggregate that they have, but that's on aggregate because the reality is it falls differently in different areas. There is no doubt that a citizen in Yorkshire in the UK feels the benefits of open markets quite differently to a citizen living in London working in the financial sector. There is no doubt about it. And so, of course, their yearning for open markets is actually not really great. And so when people say by closing the markets, by actually allowing nationalism to creep in and actually reshoring, actually nationalising businesses, etc., that's not such an unattractive notion to them. They don't see where they've won the other way around. So it's on us to continue to argue the benefits. But more than that, it's on us to help the rest of the community to share in the benefits, to get the capabilities, get the skills, enable them to actually operate in the 21st century. What we do at the ICC, so we operate in some pretty difficult places. I've developed a concept which I've been launching globally called ICC Centres of Entrepreneurship. I launched one at the request of civil society and the business community in Beirut in the middle of last year during the worst of the crisis there because they lost confidence in government. The only organisation they trusted was business, and we, of course, as the most trusted business organisation in the world, they asked us to come in. What we do with the Centre of Entrepreneurship is we help develop the skills people need to build a meaningful life for themselves and their families in an open market or a market economy. We're actually building a constituency for it, bit by bit, street by street, hundreds of entrepreneurs by hundreds of entrepreneurs. We've now opened 4 in Africa. I've opened 4 in Latin America. I've opened 2 in the Middle East and opening another 2 there. And I'm opening in Jakarta in Asia. And then actually, I'm so glad to be on this call because I'm in the process of discussing how we can do something in the Pacific Islands and obviously in other parts. These are not just drops in the ocean. These are creating open platforms everywhere we go, and they operate regionally, where we crowd in hundreds and hundreds of SMEs, for example, in our workshops in Accra, in Ghana, and you learn lots of stories about what really gets in the way of building a business there. In Buenos Aires, we're actually reached out to the next generation, 18 to 24, what's in their way, and we're building up then the courses, the support, etc., but also the advocacy for governments on a regional basis. So my view is that you actually have to continue, first of all, don't take an open market for granted, citizen support for it. You actually have to see it as a privilege. You've got to ensure that people actually get benefits from it, and you've got to argue the case for it consistently, never taken as a given.
Brilliant, John. Thank you very much. Now, final question to you, Fraser. What are the opportunities for governments and businesses to partner with each other across the region to ensure a recovery that is both resilient and sustainable?
Well, firstly, we've all learnt some new skills, and so our opportunity to partner and have dialogue digitally, such as being rapidly orchestrated with this entire APEC conference hosted by New Zealand, has increased greatly, even if we're on mute occasionally, sometimes for several minutes. But we're certainly we've got new skills which we've all learned, which I think can facilitate greater communication, cooperation, And that might sound trivial of knowing how to use these things, devices, properly, but they are augmenting the face-to-face communication out of necessity this time. But I think that will add to the greater degrees of cooperation, because the partnerships are essential for the recovery, unless we all want to do things ourselves intuitively with nationalism. But that's not recognising that people have diverse skills and capabilities to bring to a solution. And partnerships require trust. So I sort of echo some of John's comments there about setting up the kotawai of trust between market economies is very important, because when we're all making business decisions and allocating capital as an organisation or not-for-profit, we do look very closely about what is the history and what is the likelihood of having the kotawai, which is a spiritual word for in Māori for cloak, for those listening. How do we manage to work beneath that to support these activities, whether it's digitisation of supply chains, setting up new standards, activities for entrepreneurship, and exchanges for particularly our young people, and so they can realise that all of us, and particularly the APEC region, have far more in common than we don't, and that's sort of leads to giving effect to the Putrajaya vision because of that spirit of cooperation. So long may these audio-visual skills continue to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us and for allowing us this opportunity to put some questions to you. It's been wonderful listening and observing and gaining insight into both, not just your heads, but into the business that you both lead from where it is you are leading from. John Denton, thank you. E mihi nui ana kia koe. Lovely to meet you. Also you, Fraser Whineray, COO of Fonterra. John Denton, of course, is the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. And to our viewers, to those of you who have joined us from near and far, thank you so much. Don't forget that this window of opportunity does not close right now. It's going to be open. So for the questions or any sort of support that you need, please don't be shy. Fire it away. Hoi anō e te iwi. Thank you very much. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora.
Thanks. Nice to meet you, Fraser. See you soon.
Nice to meet you, John.